Good afternoon. I'm George Latimer, Westchester County Executive, and I'm joined by some of the senior managers in our executive administration during this Earth Month that we're still celebrating during the month of April, to identify 4 important pieces of legislation that are being submitted for passage here in Westchester County that we think will help us protect our environment. I'm joined by Deputy County Executive Ken Jenkins, by our Director of Research, Ellen Hendricks, and by our Director of Energy, Conservation and Sustainability, Peter McCartt. And each of us will be describing a singular piece of legislation for a package of 4 bills that will be submitted to the Westchester County Board of Legislators for their consideration and their adoption. Each of these pieces of legislation in the area of environmental protection we think will add to those laws that help us better protect the environment in our home county. What's particularly interesting is all 4 of these bills came out of work that was done in the New York State Legislature, bills that were proposed for statewide applicability that have not yet come to pass in Albany. But when we had the opportunity to look at it, the 4 of us and some other staff members who helped us, we were ably assisted by our Deputy Director of Operations, Emily Saltzman, and a few others on our team. We looked at whether bills could be adopted at the county level of government that would otherwise be adopted at the state level of government. And this is not unprecedented before. Westchester County originally passed the Tobacco 21 bill, which later was adopted by the state and then the federal government at the higher levels of government. We banned conversion therapy as relates to the LGBTQ community first, and then in sequence, the state did the same action, which overtook ours in terms of size and scope. But in this particular case, we are adding to those list of projects that we have focused on year-round, but particularly during the month of April as Earth Month. You've seen us talk in some great detail about how we're working on the electrification of the different elements of our county government, the electrification of the bus fleet, which we've now converted from diesel to hybrid electric and electric buses, the expansion of electric vehicle charging stations, which the county is doing directly, and then also incenting it happening at the local government levels. And then many local governments are doing it on their own. Ken and I were present in Tuckahoe when they, on their own, have an additional 34 charging stations as one municipality, and we're doing this all across the county. Peter was part of our presentation about demand energy response, where we try to show a different program that provides benefits to governments and to private buildings as well that would reduce the amount of electricity in peak periods of time and thereby helping us in the environment. We've had a robust effort in composting to try to take out of the waste stream certain food products that would otherwise have to be used and disposed of in our waste-to-energy plant, the Wheelabrator plant in the Peekskill area. So all of these different environmental initiatives together have added up to, we think, a very robust activity. I would highlight specifically, before we get into the particular bills, that Westchester County went on the record very strongly last November in terms of our environmental concern. The Environmental Bond Act was presented by the state legislature, the state government, before voters all across New York State, a $4.2 billion fund that would be used for a variety of environmental projects specified in certain categories. And we made an effort to get that information out to the people of Westchester, as was happening elsewhere in the state. The bond passed overwhelmingly statewide, but Westchester was one of the lead counties in this state in terms of approval. The approval level in the state approached 70%. It was the highest margin of victory for the yes side of any county outside of New York City. We actually exceeded the Bronx, which is very tough to do when you look at the population size of Westchester, that we were able to poll a stronger environmental vote than Nassau or Suffolk or the Bronx, all of which are much bigger jurisdictions than we are. But I think it proves the bipartisan appeal of environmental issues when properly crafted, when realistically structured. When we began the process, we looked at 80 bills, approximately 80 bills that were pending in the state legislature that had been endorsed by environmental advocates of New York. EANY is considered the premier legislative lobbying organization for environmental legislation at the state level of government. I dealt with them during my tenure as an assemblyman and a senator. And then all 4 of us looked at a variety of these bills, and some of them the county government did not have the authority to do. In some cases, the bills were things that really went outside of what we could administer were we to try to adopt a law along those lines. And then we also looked at the practical realities of the cost of some things, which could have been much more expensive than a county government could handle. We whittled those number of bills down to approximately a workable 15 to 20 bills. We then asked the able assistance of our county attorney, John Nona, and the law department to look at these proposed state pieces of legislation and determine if we have the legal authority within the confines of our charter and the laws of Westchester County to adopt something similar. And if we could, we would shape it so that it would reflect the laws of Westchester County. And our county attorney, Mr. Nona, and his team came back to us with a reduced number of bills, which we then had dialogue and discussion of, and we've settled on these 4 bills. And these 4 bills may not be the single most important environmental initiatives. Certainly the state government has much more power than the county government does, and they're dealing with many more higher priorities bills that environmental advocates of New York have identified. But what we've done again in Westchester County is we've shown leadership, we've shown the willingness to tackle problems that may not yet be dealt with in some other parts of the state, and take the leadership that's necessary. And in these particular areas, this is, as we come to the end of this month, we think a complementary activity to those that we've described before, that we as a government will administer programs and services, we will spend our money wisely to advance environmental initiatives, and at the same time, we will look for those areas where we can pass legislation that we think will help us as well. And with that, we hope that these 4 bills get favorable legislative consideration. We hope that those in the environmental community who watch these things will pay attention to what these bills represent and can be supportive of it. We think they're broad-based enough to have the support of everybody within our Westchester community. So I've asked each of my colleagues to take one of these bills and individually explain it. I will take the 4th bill and explain it, and then we'll proceed from there. So first, I'm going to ask our Deputy County Executive, Ken Jenkins, to discuss the first bill that we're proposing in this package of environmental bills. Ken.
Thanks, George. Certainly, one of the things that happened in evaluating all of the packages, the environmental bills that are in front of us today that we will be sending down to the Board of Legislators for their consideration, because of the county executive's leadership working with the tremendous members of the team to get to a place to talk about things that are really important. This first one is about addressing asthma in the communities of color. And that is one of those things that ties over to environmental justice, but trying to ensure that we're going to make a modification that's going to be able to be effective and actually move the ball forward in addressing asthma in communities of color. So we're going to create, by legislation, a subcommittee of the African American Advisory Board dedicated to studying the high rates of asthma in communities of color throughout Westchester County. It's going to establish this subcommittee to study the high risk of rates of asthma in the communities, amending the African American Advisory Board legislation. It'll consist of 5 members of the larger African American Advisory Board that are appointed all by the county executive. The commissioners of health, social services, and planning, or their designees, will serve as ex officio members on that subcommittee. They're going to be able to assess asthma risk factors for our minority residents, identify existing barriers for quality treatment and care among the racial and ethnic minorities, develop evidence-based intervention strategies to address that lack of health care, and launch a countywide asthma awareness campaign program. This subcommittee is going to deliver an annual report, and that's going to be part of the legislation that is going to happen, and it will be effective immediately as it is implemented. It's one of the 4 great pieces of legislation we're sending down about our environment during Earth Month. Thanks, Josh.
Now, just to reinforce the point, again, this bill has as its intellectual foundation doing this very thing at the state level of government, to create a committee to be able to look at these issues. We will do that in Westchester immediately. And I would highlight that the effort that we've made to electrify our bus system is a step in that direction. Our bus system, Beeline bus system, is most heavily found in the urbanized areas of the county, where we have a higher incidence of dense population and a higher incidence of asthma. And once we have moved off of diesel fuel, which gives an exhaust, I'm sure you're familiar with it, standing on a street corner watching the old style buses pass by, that contributes to the concentration of air pollution and exacerbates the problems of asthma within an urban area. So this is not just let's have a study, let's come up with projects like that can be practical. And I would point out that the Environmental Bond Act specifically asked for at least 30% of the projects that would be funded through that funding stream to target communities of color. And so we have, certainly in the city of Mount Vernon, but in all of our urban centers, from Portchester to Sleepy Hollow, Ossining, of course, Yonkers, White Plains, New Rochelle, Peekskill, we have those concentrations. And so the work that would come out of this committee, we hope will be practical, and we will then be able to look for funding both from the county and ideally from the money made available through the Environmental Bond Act. So this is a very practical way to go. We're working through Barbara Edwards and the African American Advisory Board on this one. Next, I'm going to ask Ellen Hendricks, who is our Director of Research, to discuss another one of these issues. In addition to her responsibilities as a Director of Research, Ellen is an elected member of the Greenburgh Town Board. So in this particular area, we're looking at an action that can happen at the county level that could be replicated at the town, the village, and the city level by local officials if they want to pattern off of what we're proposing to do here. Ellen.
Thank you. Thank you, County Executive and Deputy County Executive. Peter, it's been great working with you. The EPA estimates that lead in drinkable water or potable water can account for approximately 20% of lead levels in adults and 40 to 60% in infants from formula mixed with water that has high levels of lead content. Adults who have been exposed to unhealthy levels of lead can suffer increased blood pressure, incidence of hypertension, and decreased kidney function. Children, infants, and fetuses are even more at risk. They are vulnerable to damage to the nervous system, lower IQs, learning disabilities, hyperactivity, and anemia, among other things. The county's beautiful parks invite visitors of all ages. April heralds spring. It's also Earth Month, but the parks are used all year round, which is why the county executive and the deputy county executive's concerns for the health and well-being of our residents, and especially those of our children, are the motivation for this bill, which will provide for enhanced testing for lead in potable water systems in county parks. The bill mandates that lead concentration levels greater than 0.005 milligrams per liter triggers the need for remediation action. First draw tap samples. Those are collections of samples from cold water taps from water that has been remaining in plumbing systems for 6 hours or more. And that will be conducted by the Department of Health. All testing results and lead remediation plans, if required, are to be transmitted to the Commissioner of Parks and to the Commissioner of the Parks Department. If levels exceed the acceptable standards, the Department of Health and Parks are to provide potable water for drinking until clear, post warnings, signage, and contamination in the park, post warnings, test results, and remediation plans on public websites. And contamination must be abated within 90 days or as close as possible thereafter. The act is to take effect in 180 days after enactment. And I thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. And I'd like to highlight that Westchester County has 55 parks countywide. We have 6 golf courses, which are parks. We have 2 beaches. We have 5 pools. And then we have numerous other parks with a variety of different uses. Not all of them have the same amount of access to public water, but every one of them would fall under the responsibility of this law, and we would hope, in order to make it as possible as we can, to make sure that we've researched all of these, and then we've made the correction and the fixes that we need at all of these, so that we have a guarantee of this. And as I said at the outset, this is something that can be replicated at the town level, the city level, and the village level, and they can pattern off of the county legislation that which is possible in their communities. Next, I'd like to ask Peter McCartt to discuss the Renewable Energy Database Act, which is a third piece of legislation, once again, patterned on what is planned for the state were to pass at the state level. Peter and I first got to speak prior to this administration beginning when he was head of the Eastchester Environmental Organizations, an arm of the Eastchester town government. And as we talked about these things, the one thing that came through loud and clear is that we have to be able to have data and understand what we're facing and then have policies that respond to that in this environment. It can't be gut feel, and we can't ignore information that's out there. And if we can understand exactly how to do that, we can do things just as Peter has brought to us the demand energy program that has such great advantage already to Westchester County and great potential down the line. So in this particular act, I'll have Peter McCartt explain what we hope to accomplish by this piece of legislation. Pete?
Thank you, George. So we've had a very busy month here, and it's not quite over. And this is it's all been very exciting, and I can't thank the county executive, deputy county executive for being that chief electeds that really have pushed our agenda, and I really appreciate it. It's very meaningful to me, and as you noted by the EBA voting records, is very important to the people of Westchester. The renewable energy database is something it's going to be managed by my office, and these laws and these kind of acts or these bills that we're putting forward create durability. So long after we're gone, this will continue, and this is one of those things because it's going to be managed by my office, but we'll be using. It establishes a municipal renewable energy system siting database for those interested in siting renewable energy systems on their available land, whether it's municipal, business, schools, whatever. We're going to create this database. It allows for municipalities to publish their goals and facilitate development of renewable energy systems. It may foster economic development by creating jobs in the manufacturing and installation of these renewable systems. Municipalities are entitled to provide information to be included in the database. And I will be utilizing various departments here, mostly planning and our IT department and the excellent GIS system that we have, a global information system that we have. And this too will take effect 180 days after enacted, and that's when I get to work even more so. And I do want to thank working with Ellen and the team on this project. I really appreciate collaborating with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. I also want to thank a number of other people who've been involved in this process. Peter Lauren, who is with us here, has worked doing some research work under some direction from Ellen and others. It was also a very important part of this. He has past experience as legislative director in my office as a state assemblyman and state senator, and he brought some of that experience in terms of looking at the state laws and trying to distill out which ones had the best opportunity. The fourth and the final bill in this package, which we're going to submit, they stand as separate individual pieces of legislation presented at the same time, is the Equity and Environmental Legislation Act. This ensures that all communities are treated fairly when the county is considering any new law in an effort to combat historical cases of violations of environmental justice. This is a declaration of policy of equal treatment in the development and the enforcement of environmental laws. The county is intended through this to foster and create conditions under which people can thrive, and that they also have no disproportionate exposure or risk of exposure to pollution. We've seen many of the placement of a variety of environmental structures, sewer treatment plants, transfer stations, in settings now that are the most densely populated areas that have the greatest diversity, but also bring the greatest impact to the neighborhoods where they're located, and that this has to become part of how we go about making plans in the future to avoid that type of concentration with all of the attendant problems that come out of that. So this bill, as I said, as the other ones, are all patterned off of statewide legislation that were scored highly by environmental advocates, environmental community in general. We think each of them has their benefit together. Each of these bills are standalone and will be dealt with by the Board of Legislators as standalone pieces of legislation, as we did when we submitted the Truthful Disclosure Act a few months ago. There will be debate, there'll be discussion, there'll be some modification perhaps, and we will negotiate out those differences. As you may see from the issues we're dealing with right now at the state level of government, the state budget includes both fiscal and policy matters, so issues like this would be embedded in the state budget in ways that do not happen here. We deal with these issues independently and separately. We pass our budget, we pass it on time, it's balanced, it's here, and now we deal with matters of public policy as a separate, distinct situation. One of the reasons why Westchester and county governments in general function in the way we do. In general, these four bills in the environmental community complement the other activities I've alluded to earlier that Pete has been involved in day to day. This also complements the other issues we've prioritized over our time as the executive branch of this government. We have been forceful about lowering property taxes. We've done so at the county property tax level for the last 4 consecutive years, and that's unprecedented in recent memory. We have been concerned about the fear of crime and what we can do to help lessen that. And by fully funding our county police department and having them work with the modern technology and working in concert with the 40 local police departments, we have seen a demonstrable reduction in crime from 2017, the year before we took office, to 2022. And the fear of crime is out there. People believe that crime is at the highest it's ever been. They were not with me in the 1970s riding the subway trains late at night when I was going to graduate school. But where we are today in Westchester County is below where we were in 2017. We have been effectively fighting crime, using the professionals whose job it is to fight crime, and then in the incarcerative world of corrections to deal with that, and in the world of probation. Those 3 departments together of county government working together. We've done initiatives such as money invested for maternal health outcomes for those women of color in the project that we're doing in Yonkers, which is now being discussed as a statewide program. We've implemented mental health crisis response teams, a recommendation of our police reform group. We've already put that into place to try to deal with some of the mental health issues of how people might act out in a public setting, and how the police can respond with the assistance of mental health professionals to de-escalate a situation. We've invested money in child care. We've invested money in helping victims of domestic violence. And we've invested money in improving the infrastructure of this county. The parks are infinitely better today than they were 5 years ago. And look at what's happened at Spray Ridge Pools, at the Miller House, and the North County Trailway, and the South County Trailway, and where we made commitments, such as we would build a new New Rochelle Family Court, where we made commitments such as we would see the revivification of Memorial Field. All those things have happened. I say all of those things to stand behind these things, that these today are our announcements today of legislation that we believe will have a helpful, beneficial environmental effort. This is not the end of the things we need to do. This does not take us to where we need to be, nor do any of the other things I've referenced. But this administration, these professionals with me, and the professionals who are not up here right now, those that are involved in information technology, who are using every effort to stop cybersecurity concerns, those who are involved in the budget and the finance function of this government to make sure that we have a stable budget, that we have a defensible amount of money in reserves to handle problems that may come up, and they may be coming up. Also, the ability of us to have professionals in treating sewerage, and those professionals who provide recreation, the professionals in mental health and in our Department of Health to deal with whatever comes next down the line with COVID or the next possible thing. All of these things represent a commitment to governance. And in these particular pieces of legislation, we are partnering with the Board of Legislators to try to enact laws that we think will be sound and that will help us advance our environmental agenda. We cannot live in a world filled with crime. We can't live in a world with costs that exceed what we can afford to do, which is why we suspended bus fares and why we took off sales tax on energy costs over the wintertime. We have to do everything we can to govern well for the people of Westchester County. That is what we're doing. These bills are part of that process. I appreciate your attention, and we will report back to you as there's progress made in each of these areas.